Hey everyone! On today's episode of the DOJO podcast, I've got recurring guest Eric Siron on to talk about all things Hyper-V Server. Now, Hyper-V Server, again, is the free SKU of Windows Server that contains just what's needed to run Hyper-V and failover clustering on premises. A lot of people use it for things like open source workloads and things that don't require Windows Server licensing. Now, we're going to be talking about what it is, who it's for, why it's going away, and more importantly, alternatives to allow you to continue to kind of scratch that virtualization itch on premises for free, right? All coming up next on the SysAdmin Dojo podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the SysAdmin Dojo podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the kick-ass system administrator within your organization. As always, I'm your host, Andy Sirwich, and I've got one of our recurring guests on the show here. I've got Eric Siron. How's it going, my friend?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Can't complain. It's been kind of an interesting world in the cloud and infrastructure space here recently, right? With all this hybrid cloud talk, Azure Stack HCI, Azure, AWS, Windows Server 2022. One thing I kind of want to focus on for this episode is talk about Hyper-V Server, which is the free SKU of Hyper-V, right? And that always confuses people, right? It always confuses people because they're like, wait, Hyper-V Server, you mean Hyper-V? I feel like the name Hyper-V Server and the feature, the role Hyper-V, it's not a feature, it's a role technically, right? The role Hyper-V, they go hand in hand for some people, and it confuses people. Surprise, Microsoft naming conventions confusing people, right? That's nothing new or anything, right?
No.
Anyway, so I guess what I wanted to start with first is just so we're all on the same page, all of our listeners are on the same page. I was just wondering, Eric, if you could kind of explain what is Hyper-V Server in a general sense.
Well, it's Windows Server stripped down to the bare minimum, and then just enough put back in to run Hyper-V and failover clustering.
And that's so pretty much it, right?
And probably the major thing is the licensing module is not present, or whatever is there is just a stub, just so that it runs and keeps it happy, so it acts like it's a permanently activated copy of Windows Server.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned licensing, because that's one of the big differences between Hyper-V Server and the other SKUs of Windows Server, right? Because, I mean, when people think Windows Server, they think standard data center. Now Azure Edition is an edition of Windows Server as well. But Hyper-V Server is its own SKU. And from a licensing perspective, there is none, right? There is none.
There is, okay, if you get into the legal stuff, the license is the part where you say, I agree. That's the license. So yes, it has a license. But there's no key to plug in. There's no accounting that you need to do somewhere so that I have this. You don't have to do anything. There's no tracking it. More like a Linux machine, I guess, in that way, in that there's a license, but most people are free to ignore it for what they're going to do with it.
Right, exactly. And I think that brings me to my next question of like, hey, we've got this free SKU of Windows Server that contains, like you said, a stripped down version of Windows Server, and it contains what administrators need to run virtual machines, to do clustering, and basically run a Hyper-V cluster, right? I mean, that's basically what's contained inside of this version of the OS. And from a use case perspective, because there's no licensing rights, I mean, I don't see myself ever running Windows VMs in this fashion, because if I was planning on running Windows VMs, I would go out and I would buy standard or data center, depending on the scale of my plans, right?
Right. And I would challenge that. I don't think that's what I would do. I like the minimal everything. Yep. And I like the fact that it can never go wrong. If you disconnect, do whatever. There are a lot of people who try really valiantly to air gap their virtualization layer.
Right.
I've never really seen it actually air gap, so I'm not a real big believer in air gapping. But let's say you pull it off, the hypervisor never needs to check in ever. So that was one very valid case use for it. And a big one that I always thought is, if you're at the data center level and you are segregated from the other admins. You're not a Windows admin. You are a virtualization admin. You're a data center admin.
Right.
You are free to roll out Hyper-V as hot and fast as you can get the new SKUs. Whereas you don't have to go in and say, hey, are we up to date on Windows Server licenses so that I can upgrade the host, right? You don't have to wait for those iterations, which in some organizations are a big deal, and some there's not. So you weren't tied. Your guest and your host were not tied together version-wise beyond the whatever supported version levels. You can only get so far out of SKU before they're not supported. It may not work anymore, but
yeah, that's true.
Barring that, though, right? Your life cycle of your operating systems are uncoupled to the virtualization layer from the server layer because you do not need to coordinate licensing.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And the other thing you brought up that I'm glad you did is the whole air gapping discussion, right? And it makes me think about one of the things that I really liked about Hyper-V Server is that it really kind of forced the issue of server core, right? Ever since server core came out in, what was it, 2008 R2, I think is when server core was first introduced.
For
those that listen to the show, this isn't a surprise. I'm sure you've heard it before. But if I go way back to my early system administration days, I was a Linux guy, right? So I mean, like, stripped down, command line, bare bones, give me just what I need to get the job done. Server core was like, where do I sign? Like, I want to run server core, So the fact that Hyper-V Server kind of forces that server core mentality, I really like that about it. And again, back to the air gapping discussion, really, core follows security best practices, and obviously you never want your hypervisors compromised. And I've even seen, this is by no means a new trend, but I've seen a lot of installations where the infrastructure layer of a customer's data center or their server rack or whatever scale they are, I've seen situations where those organizations will configure like a management domain and like a dedicated Active Directory instance just for their management domain, right? And that way,
yes, popular solution.
Yes, exactly, and it works really well. And I mean, yeah, I
have not seen it work all that well, but okay. I know a lot of people swear by it, but most admins I run into just swear at it. So,
I maybe working well is not the correct term, I guess. When we're talking about, I mean, mainly it's done from a security perspective, right? And in terms of security, it is one more hurdle that the bad guys have to get over, right?
On paper, yes.
On paper, yes. On paper.
In reality, and this is the same thing I don't like about air gapping. It only works until that first time you're like, well, just this one time. So the problem is everybody else is still operating under the assumption that they have an air gap or they have a fully separated domain. One guy made one pinhole somewhere, nobody's looking for it because it shouldn't be there.
Right.
So as far as, and what I have always counseled people to do is if you really genuinely have the diligence and the discipline to make it happen, yes, it is really super secure. But I just always assume that none of my networks are air gapped and secure them that way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just start off assuming that there's a hole somewhere and you just have to go find it. And
yeah, that's a good point. Because typically in that situation where, like I said, they have a dedicated domain just for infrastructure management, usually it's paired with like a dedicated management subnet, right? That is, and the IP space is segregated from the production network. But still, like you said, there's always that one case where like, oh, hey, we need this backend server on this IP range to talk with this on the production network. There's always those.
There's always something, and there's patching and all kinds of considerations. And now, of course, Hyper-V server's gone, so you have to license those.
Yeah.
And they have to talk to something that can reach something else.
Yep.
You can straddle your KMS server if you like, but guess what? That's not air gapped anymore. So
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Hyper-V server is gone. That's a good segue into the next part of this conversation I want to get to. So, we kind of talked about who it's for, what it does, and we've talked about some example use cases for it. The one use case I did want to mention that I don't think came up yet, the other place I've seen it really popularly used for is open source workloads, right? So, hey, I've got a bunch of open source workloads I want to run. I like Hyper-V. I don't need to run any Windows guest VMs. I'm going to use Hyper-V server for that. But again, that's just the one example I wanted to bring up. I had it written down on my notes here. But in terms
There's
of
one other that a lot of people have forgotten about,
Mm-hmm.
remote desktop services.
Oh, right.
But they see the the RDS team killed this in Server 2019, and really nobody threw a fit, so I guess it wasn't a problem. But up through 2016, you could deploy the virtualization component of a remote desktop services to a Hyper-V host, a Hyper-V server host,
Right.
and it would work. Starting with Server 2019, that wouldn't. It had to be running Windows Server.
And I think the caveat there was you had to be properly licensed on the client side, correct?
Correct. And the whole thing, and the reason where I was going with that is that up until then, that's the only thing you had to be licensed for.
Right.
But then whenever they threw Windows Server back in, you have to use Windows Server. Well, now you have to be licensed for that physical instance of Windows Server, even though the only thing you're doing with it is virtualization. It's the actual thing that they're calling, Hyper-V Server. This is literally what it is for.
Right.
And people were doing that, and then they said, well, no, we're going to take that away.
Right. Right.
But I did not hear a lot of screaming, so maybe it really wasn't a big problem. I don't know.
Right. Which then, yes, again, segueing to the next part of the conversation, and that is the question of what is happening to Hyper-V Server, right? And when this initially started coming out, you saw all this panic in the industry. Oh my God, Microsoft's killing Hyper-V. No.
Right. I remember that.
They're killing Hyper-V Server, the free version of Hyper-V. Hyper-V is one of the backbone major components of Azure and is going nowhere anytime soon. And it's still in Windows Server today, even in Windows Server 2022, the paid version of Windows Server 2022. Another fun fact that a lot of people don't know, Hyper-V actually runs on the Xbox as well. That's one of my favorite trivia pieces about Hyper-V is there's a VM for all the media services, and then there's a VM for the gaming services as well. Anyway, not relevant to this discussion, but I always enjoy that little tidbit. Anyway, this is what you come to listen to the podcast for, these little interesting, useless bits of information that you don't need for your day job, right? Anyway, I digress. So, what is happening to Hyper-V Server? As Eric mentioned, Hyper-V Server is going away. So the 2019 version of Hyper-V Server is the last version of Hyper-V. And this mainly came up in a Microsoft Communities thread with Eldon Christensen from the Windows Server team. I'll go ahead and link to this thread in the show notes, so be sure to check it out there. But basically in this particular thread, while it's by no means an official announcement, it's very clear from Microsoft in this thread that, hey, Hyper-V Server is going away. We're not going to release a version of it for 2022, and that is not included in our strategic direction for Windows Server anymore. So basically, Hyper-V Server is dead moving forward. That said, 2019, it follows the support cycle for Windows Server 2019, so it will continue to get security updates until, 2028, I think, is when the extended service support for 2019 is over.
It should follow the Windows Server 2019 model.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's going to be around and usable for a while, but you won't get feature updates, you won't get improvements, that type of thing. You'll get security stuff, like I said, but that's about it. So, and when this kind of came out, there was a lot of outcry in the community, and it kind of was followed by this angst, I guess I would say, and I've talked about it on the show before, and I've talked about it in a few webinars, and that, if Microsoft's move to Azure, it was kind of a nudge. They were trying to nudge administrators to start consuming Azure services. After this announcement came out, a lot of administrators and a lot of IT pros in the industry started feeling not so much a nudge, but more of a shove at that point, right? Like, hey,
yes,
you're taking away this free SKU. You're trying to get me to use Azure Stack HCI, which is $10 per physical core per month. So it's by no means a free solution. And so a lot of people started feeling this shove towards Azure, and it created a lot of angst, right? So the question always came back to, like, hey, why is this happening? And I had been asked a couple of times on webinars, like, hey, why are they making this choice? And I didn't know at the time, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I didn't know at the time exactly why this decision had been made. But like I said in this particular webinar where I was asked this question, I said, hey, I've worked with Microsoft in the MVP community as a customer, as a partner, long enough to understand that Microsoft, they don't make these choices just because there's always a reason, right? And so I had Ben Armstrong on. You know Ben, Eric. So for those listening, Ben Armstrong, for a long, long time, was largely considered to be the quote-unquote Hyper-V guy at Microsoft. He owns Hyper-V, basically, and he was the lead on that product group team. He's now moved on to AKS on Azure Stack HCI. That's his baby now. But in episodes 5 and 6 of this podcast, I had Ben on, and we had a great discussion. So episode 5, we actually talked about AKS on Azure Stack HCI, but it's Ben, and I would be doing all of our listeners a disservice if I didn't ask Ben about Hyper-V. So episode 6 is basically Ben's current thoughts on Hyper-V, and more importantly, I asked Ben, hey, what happened with Hyper-V server? And like I said, that's episode 6. Feel free to go back and take a listen to that. But the TLDR of that discussion basically is upgrading and maintaining Hyper-V server with the current iteration of Windows Server became more developer intensive than they thought it was going to be. So basically, when it came to, because I don't know if you remember, Eric, when Server 2019 was released, it was 6, 7, 8 months later before Hyper-V Server came out. And the reason for that is when they went to upgrade that particular SKU to Windows Server 2019, it just broke everything in the Hyper-V server stack, and that SKU, it just broke everything. So it took 6, 7, 8 months of developer time to get it production ready. And I mean, from their perspective, it makes total sense. Hey, I'm going to spend 8 months of developer time for a product I'm not making any money on. I mean, the math just doesn't add up. And I know a lot of people don't like that answer, right? Because, oh, hey, you're taking a free tool away from us. But they got to keep the lights on. Not that they're having trouble keeping the lights on, but you know what I mean.
And I would like to hear some more of that debate too, because anybody can tell you that you don't necessarily get all of your revenue directly.
Right.
So there's going to be a cost. There's going to be a cost, and I don't know that any of us know it yet, but Microsoft also knows that they've killed some really popular things in the past and lived to tell about it.
Oh, yeah.
Windows Media Center Edition, remember that? That was
the
whole world. We're not going to use Microsoft anymore, and well, here we are. More than 15 years later, we're all still using it. So,
yep. That's funny.
There's going to be a cost.
Oh, definitely.
I would want to hear more about. Anyway, you continue.
I was going to say, I mean, Ben, that was the TLDR, right? That was the short version. Ben went into far more detail than that, and really kind of gave us a behind the scenes, this is what happened. These were the discussions that were happening, and at least for me, it kind of put that whole what happened to Hyper-V server discussion to rest, right?
Right.
Excuse me. So, that's kind of what happened to Hyper-V server, and that begs the question, hey, will we ever see it again? I mean, I'm not Microsoft, so I can't answer that. But if I had to guess, just based on all the bits and pieces of information that I've been watching about this particular issue over the last 3, 4, 5 months, I'm going to say no. I think they're pretty much done with that particular SKU. And they've even said that, hey, our strategic direction for the folks that were using Hyper-V server, our strategic direction moving forward is Azure Stack HCI, which I said is that $10 per physical core per month solution. Now, you're getting a lot of value for that $10 per physical core. You're getting all those Azure integrations, those manager capabilities that you get in Azure Arc. I mean, we could spend a whole podcast talking about that. And we've got a webinar coming up, which I'll tell you guys about later on. But yeah. So will we ever see it again? I don't think so. So that's just my take on the subject. I don't know, Eric, if you have any thoughts on whether we'll see it again or not, but that's just my gut feeling.
I wonder. And another thing, I kind of keep a foot in the developer world because I'm not a software developer, but I do like to write. I'm a hobbyist programmer, I guess. And I know that there's a whole lot of concern about the amassed technical debt of the Windows code base.
Right.
So one thing that you would look at as well, if it had, this stripped down kernel and then they were just plugging pieces into it, it wouldn't be so bad. But this is an old code base.
Oh, yeah.
So And there's a lot of work I know they're looking to switch some things from C and C++ over to Rust. And there's a lot of, I guess you might call it refactoring going on in a lot of the user layers. I can see that maybe there's like a plot to retroactively and slowly over time get this code base up to something a little bit more modern. And if they do that, a lot of the problems you were just describing may go away, and maybe we will see a Hyper-V server again. But if that happens, you and I may be retired. I don't think the ship is moving very fast.
Right.
But I think it's possible. The bigger concern, though, is like what you had just said is something about, well, the people on Hyper-V server, they want them to go to Azure Stack Azure Stack HCI, and I'm thinking, of all the use cases that you and I talked about at the beginning of this call, which one of those is Azure Stack HCI appropriate for? It won't work in an air gap situation. It's not going to work if you want a super stripped down model. It's not going to work if you want to stay away from your licensing timing concerns. It's just like everything I'm going over. It will, I guess, run Azure Virtual Desktop, I think. So I guess that's one thing.
Plus right. You get the added benefits of Azure Kubernetes Service, which episode 5 of the podcast, Ben talks all about that. So be sure to check that out. Sorry, continue, Eric.
I'm just thinking, if replacing Hyper-V server is the way to go, I think Azure Stack is literally the exact opposite of what most people would want to use Hyper-V server for. I think it's the point farthest from, honestly.
That's a good point. And again, it comes back to the whole angst of the decision, right? And why people are upset with it. Because I feel like people are like, okay, I'm using Hyper-V server, like, what now, right? And that's funny you bring that up, because that's the next thing I want to kind of get into as part of this topic today, is like, hey, okay, I'm using Hyper-V server in my data center today or my lab or whatever. Where do I go from here, right? And I mean, when I start thinking about alternatives, I mean, the first thing I think of is like, okay, I think about the support lifecycle for Hyper-V Server 2019. And again, it's not going anywhere today. It's still going to be around, right, until 2028. But at some point, there's going to be some new fancy features or something that's modern, in a couple of years, a modern hypervisor is going to be able to do that Hyper-V server won't be able to do. And that you're going to get to a point to where it's like, okay, I can't be on Hyper-V server 2019 anymore. So like, where do you go? And I organizing for this episode, I started making a list of like, okay, if it was me, what would I do, right? I mean, I kind of broke it down into two different sections. Like, okay, one, if I have a single host, what am I going to do, right? And then the other section I broke it down into is like, okay, if I'm running a cluster, what would be my alternative? And I guess let's start with kind of that single host discussion first. Let's assume I have a single host. Maybe I'm an SMB, right? Or I'm running a lab. Where would I go? And I guess it's always top of mind for me because, I've always had one foot in the VMware world and one foot in the Hyper-V world. ESXi, the free hypervisor on the VMware side, is always kind of an alternative I see from a single host perspective. You can certainly go that route. So that could be a viable option. There's problems when we get to the clustering discussion, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I don't know, Eric, do you see that as a viable alternative?
Minimally,
right?
I still, and especially the use case you're throwing out here is the SMB. Well, the SMB is like probably a 90% chance they're running Hyper-V server. They're also running Windows Server, and all it takes is one copy of Windows Server on the box, and you have to license it for everything that Windows Server would give you, with Hyper-V as your management operating system. So I think your SMBs are just going to ride out 2019 and shift to whatever version of Windows Server they want at that time. They'll mumble and grumble, but they're going to be okay.
Yeah.
I really, if you want to talk use cases, I think 90% of people are going to be okay because of, they'll have an upgrade path. And it's just Windows to Windows. There's no virtual machine version migration, nothing like that. So I don't know that.
I was going to say that.
I think you would have to get back into those edge cases where you don't have Windows Server running on it, or you're just really just that dead set against Windows Server as your management operating system.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because, for 90% of people, they're going to grumble and complain probably about it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they're going to be okay, right? Like you said, they're going to move on to the, they're going to move on from there depending on which route they want to go. So yeah, like you said, ESXi, maybe. I think for me, that's a maybe as a potential destination. And then in terms of
it's a hard shift. That's a hard lifting
shift.
It's not easy.
It is. Yep. And then in terms of other possible destinations, to be honest, I was kind of racking my brain on this because I'm just like, I guess I've been spoiled in that I've always had a fully licensed non-free solution available at my fingertips. I'm a little spoiled, right? But I mean, I start thinking about the other free hypervisors that I could go to out there. And I'm like, I guess KVM in the open source world, which supportability becomes a concern, right? I mean, it's, it works well, but, it's not as easy or user-friendly to set up and manage. And again, like I said, supportability is an issue. The other thing is, I mean, yeah, you could go with something like VirtualBox, but that just feels icky because you have to have that. Solution. Yeah, you have to have that host OS layer and then install VirtualBox on top of it, and it's just, it just feels icky. I mean, it's a fine product.
In the data center, it's not ever. Yeah, no, it's great for what it is. It is wonderful for what it is.
Exactly,
it is not intended to be a data center enterprise project. It's just not good.
Exactly. Totally agree. So, I mean, I kind of run out of ideas on the single host option here. I don't know. Do you have any others that I haven't mentioned, Eric, that I'm neglecting to think about?
Well, not exactly. I do remember when earlier when they were talking about this, like the very first complaint that I heard was, what about our test environments? A lot of people like to put Hyper-V server out there because then it's like, now I just don't have to deal with the licensing. And you got to be careful. Nowhere in the documentation or the licensing, anything does it say test servers are somehow different. So you got to be careful when you say, I didn't license my test environment. Like, maybe keep that to yourself. So, but if you're going to walk that line, Windows Server will run in trial mode for like 180 days.
That's true.
And it's got Hyper-V built in. So
that's true.
You're really walking a fine line on not going to, some kind of when the auditor shows up and you've got 37 copies of Windows Server trial running in your core.
It's kind of a gray area there, right?
I don't know, but
I'm thinking
because there was mentions. Somebody somewhere said there will always be a way to run Hyper-V for free, and that is what they landed on. I'm like, that feels dirty.
I'm not sure that would hold up in an audit. I mean, I'm not an auditor. I'm not a lawyer. It just doesn't feel like it would hold up in an audit,
I do know that I have never worked for enterprise of any size where they would have just said, you know what, just buy Windows Server. Don't even play this game. This is not worth it.
Right.
But smaller organizations who are like, well, that's like, $900. So maybe we should look into
right. And I mean, the cost,
I don't know.
The cost does come into the discussion because I played out a hypothetical situation in my mind. I'm like, okay, let's assume my 2-node cluster in the basement. Let's assume it's a production system, right? I'm like, if I move that to Azure Stack HCI, what would it cost me? Now, each of those nodes has 6 physical cores each in it. And so I'm talking $120 a month to run Azure Stack HCI on that cluster. Now, what is that? 720, or we're talking roughly $1,500 a year to operate that cluster. And if I stretch that out over 3 years, which is typically like a licensing cycle, right? 3 to 5 years. I mean, now from a cost perspective, it's like, I mean, if I wanted all the benefits of the Azure integrations and stuff, yeah, I'm going to go with Azure Stack HCI. Right. But if I wasn't using that stuff, I'd be looking at standard licensing pretty hard at that point.
Absolutely. It would save you money in the first year.
Yep. Exactly. If I'm an SMB, again, that everything I just said assumes I'm an SMB, right?
Right.
Interesting. Yeah. So coming back to our alternatives discussion here, I want to talk about like a clustered scenario now. So let's assume I've been using Hyper-V server in a clustered scenario, right? Maybe I'm hosting some open source workloads. And again, was kind of racking my brain here in terms of like free alternatives, right? And it was even more difficult, right? ESXi becomes a complete no-go because of the lack of vCenter. In order to do clustering with ESXi, it requires vCenter.
Right.
You got to pay for vCenter, so that's out.
Right.
KVM, you can do some basic clustering. Again, same issue. You've got supportability concerns, and it's just not as easy. There might be some KVM people listening, and they're like, Andy, what are you talking about? It's super easy. It's been a long time since I've looked
at... the first thing I say, is it easy for you?
Correct.
Or is it easy for me?
Right, correct. My point is KVM is great at what it does, but it's an open source tool. It's a good open source tool, but supportability
is made for people who are really ready to, this is what they want to do with their lives.
Exactly.
Not everybody out there is quite there yet.
Right. And then
I want to say there are other alternatives out there today. I don't believe that is the end of the list. It's just, if you and I working together cannot think of them quickly, they're not that big, which means your regular SMB guy is not ready for it.
Exactly. The other one that came to mind when I started thinking about clustering, I don't have any hands-on experience with it myself, but I have seen a lot of people mention it, and that's XCP-NG, which is like an open source iteration of the Zen hypervisor, right? Okay. So like I said, I've never used it myself, so I can't vouch for it. But if you look at their webpage, it talks about virtual machine migration and clustering. So it appears it can do it. Again, no hands-on experience. I don't know if it works well or not. But again, open source. I mean, I love open source. It sounds like I'm knocking open source. That's not the case. It's just supportability becomes a concern, especially when you're running your whole business on it.
Exactly. We often overlook that. You're like, okay, I've got this thing, and it replaced my Hyper-V server. It's great. It's awesome. Now I'm going to install my line of business application on it. And then Jenny in accounting gets a print error. She calls support, and they're like, oh, you're running in an unsupported configuration. We don't care if you can't print. And then, of course, your admin is like, they're not even kind of related, but you think that matters?
Right.
They're just going to hang up on you. And this is a real concern that people should have.
Definitely.
And of course, part of it, I think we're raising the specter that can someone support the open source? That isn't necessarily the concern. The concern is when it's in your environment, how do your other vendors feel about it? And if they decide we're not going to support you anymore, well, then what?
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. And I mean, the flip side of that argument, there are going to be people out there to be like, hey, Andy, Hyper-V server was a free tool. Like, that wasn't supported either. But here's the thing. If I'm running Hyper-V server in my environment and something breaks, with Hyper-V server, I could still call Microsoft and be like, here, take my money, now fix my stuff, Yes. So you could get help if you needed it. So
yes. And it was a Windows environment for your vendors who were worried.
Right. Exactly. So, at the end of this conversation, like I knew this is where we would end up. But I was hoping, there was a part of me that was hoping we would end up with hey, here's the clear answer of where you go. And I mean, like,
right.
There just isn't one, unfortunately,
There's really not. And I think Microsoft is kind of banking that their Hyper-V server is not that popular, all things considered. I don't know the facts myself. I don't have any statistics on it, but it's maybe the game. And the gamble will be fine. Because the other thing, too, is like, what if we had come up with a perfect, free, easy to manage, clustered hypervisor right here, right now on this call? What if we had come up with one? The next question is, how do I get there from here?
Yeah, that's true.
And migrating between existing solutions is horrible.
It is. It is.
So you get this new magic candy one out here, and is that going to be any better? So,
probably not. Very true. Yeah. So, I mean, we've kind of listed the options. And I mean, again, I think what we've done is we've come back to that tried and true IT answer of it depends, right? It depends on your particular situation. So, but I think at least hopefully we've at least given a couple of options that people can look at. And again, it's going to be fine for most people, right? So
Yeah, I'm going to tell people, I think it's like, this is not a great situation. I understand. I feel your pain. I don't like it either. I don't want to minimize anybody who's upset about this because they're
right.
right. You know, I'll say you still have a path forward on Windows Server, and most of us are already licensed for it. It's just to have this happen to you. And there wasn't, I feel like Microsoft owed us a lot of heads up and we
Yep.
didn't get. And I think that's a good, because I think a lot of times if you just tell people like, hey, you know what, we've really tried.
Right.
We really did. And this is just so hard. It's just not viable. I think people, but they understand that. I mean, if anybody is in IT and they're bored, we all have too much work to do.
Right.
So usually you just explain it like, this is where we are. And I don't feel like you should have to get a call between MVP and somebody like Ben Armstrong to get that message into the public. I think that should just be like, guys, this is really hard to do. And we're sorry. It doesn't fit with our cadence. And
yeah, I know.
Here we are.
I was, to be honest, I was really surprised that one, there was no real official message that came out, right? And then two, I was super happy when I was talking with Ben about AKS and I asked him about, Hyper-V server, and it was so difficult not to like cheer and just be super giddy on camera while we were recording that episode when he just started explaining what led up to that decision. I was so happy when he started going into that. But anyway, again, that's episode 6. Be sure to check that out. That was a good one. So, well, Eric, I appreciate you taking the time to come out and kind of talk through this with me. This, it's these kinds of things, these it depends type of conversations that are always the most fun for me. So I appreciate you sharing your insights and coming out, my friend. I'm sure we'll have you on for another one soon. Those of you that are watching or listening, the other thing I wanted to mention is, we've been talking about Azure Stack HCI a few times on this particular episode. We actually did a webinar on Azure Stack HCI not that long ago. If you are interested in checking that out on demand, the link for that is in the description of the podcast, so be sure to check that out. Also, be sure to check out the DOJO, so it's altero.com/dojo, and we have a number of different sections out there. You can pick your poison. I mean, we've got Hyper-V, VMware, MSP, backup and DR, Microsoft 365. We've got some Azure content out there. So we got a lot of great, highly focused technical content out there for you guys. So be sure to check that out. Other than that, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you for a future episode of the Dojo Podcast. Thanks for listening. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.